Hi, folks. This is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report. I got to tell you, I called my buddy Jigger Jim about Black Lake, and we've talked about Black Lake in other ways. But I wanted to find out just how the fishing is there right now. And the one thing he did tell me is all the visitors are pretty much gone. They've closed the shop down because there's just not people visiting this time of the year. I says, does that mean there's not a lot of people out fishing? He says, oh no, there's people out there. And the bass fishing right now is the best. I says, tell me what you mean by the best. He says, it's the best it's been all year. Number one, there aren't an awful lot of people fishing, but also the smallmouths are really active this time of the year. So I wanted to find out more about that. I said, Jigger Jim, I said, what bait works the best? Knowing full and well he's going to tell me a jig, but he didn't. He said his fishing partner that he fishes with all the time loves to use crankbaits. And he said they were fishing recently, and he hooked a bass there, a smallmouth. And he said, oh my gosh, he said, Jim, get the net. Get the net. This thing is huge. And Jim had the net. He's waiting. He's not all that thrilled. He doesn't really know what to expect. And he said, but the fish wasn't coming up. It wasn't coming up. And he says, finally, we got it to the surface. I got it in the net, and it wasn't an it. It was a them. There were two fish hooked on the lure, one on the back hook and one on the front hook. And he said, honestly, that one on the front hook looked to be, and Jim has fished his whole life, and he's pretty accurate in what he's talking about. He said it looked to be about 6 pounds, and the one on the back hook was probably 3. Even a 3-pound smallmouth is a dandy. For a lot of us, it would be a lunker. And so this led to more conversation. I said, so since you're Jigger Jim, I assume you're not using these. He says, no, I'm not stupid. I may be Jigger Jim, but if they're hitting crankbaits, that's what I'm going to use. And he says, but my son Seth is fantastic with crankbaits. And I talked on another show about obsession, about maybe obsession isn't the right word, but total dedication to perfecting your way of fishing any given lure that you select to use. And Seth has become really, really adept at catching fish with crankbaits. I mean, really good. So what does he do? Jim says what he does now, if we're fishing 10 feet of water, he chooses a crankbait that will go 20 feet. And so what happens is that 20-foot diving crankbait will go down and start bumping the bottom. And he says, as that bumps the bottom, Seth immediately takes the pressure off and sweeps the rod. It allows it to start floating back up. And he says then when he loses contact with the bottom, he goes back down. He says what's happening is those baits that will go 20 feet down are bigger. They're bigger, heavier baits. They may not be sinking baits, but they're bigger. So that when you put that force against them and start reeling them down, faster you reel them, the quicker they're going to dive down. But he thinks the bigger crankbaits are having an effect, and also the fact that they're bumping the bottom. I said, doesn't it snag? He says, yeah, if you reel it real fast, if you dive it into the bottom, those zebra mussels are going to grab it, basically. He was joking, but that's what can happen. But the point of all this is, number one, the smallmouth fishing on Black Lake right now is really good, and there's a lot of really big smallmouth in Black Lake. We're talking 4 and even 5-pound smallmouth. That fishing with crankbaits can be very, very effective. The one other thing Jim talked about, and it's getting back to the 2 fish on 1 crankbait, if they're in a feeding sort of activity period, those fish are going to try to beat the other one to a certain type of lure. And he said to me, if you're using a crankbait, here's my recommendation. He says, if you're catching the fish on the front hook, on the nose hook, on the front of the lure, then they really want it. If you're catching them on the rear hook, it means they're following and maybe nibbling or doing whatever. So if that's the case, use the same bait but change colors. Keep changing colors till you start catching them on the front hook, which means they're more aggressive. They want that more than they did that other color. That's his advice. I'm passing it on because, they're fishing these crankbaits a lot more than I do. And they will come up with suggestions that can help us all use those crankbaits in a better way, and I think that's what he's doing. But the bass fishing right now, especially for smallmouths on Black Lake, is really, really good. And he said they can be at any depth. A lot of things, what they're chasing right now is 3-inch, you can't call them baby anymore, 3-inch perch. They're gorging on the perch. Now, in another body of water, perch colored bait might not work at all because there might not be perch in that water. He says in the St. Lawrence River, it's gobies and crayfish, but the bass in Black Lake really gorge themselves on baby perch. It's interesting. It can help you select the right color, and it may be a place that you can get to fish right now that you wouldn't have considered. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meissner with the North Country Fishing Report.